Today in class you learned about the different words that have to do with heredity. In this video I will discuss the history of heredity and also explain how scientists can predict what traits will be passed down from generation to generation. First, it's important to know that heredity is the passing of traits from parent to offspring. We learned in the last unit that the process of meiosis creates sex cells called the egg and the sperm. Both of these cells contribute 23 chromosomes to the zygote. So the zygote will have a total of 46 chromosomes. These chromosomes contain the DNA that make up who you are. An allele or alleles are the different forms of a trait that make up a gene pair. So you have an allele for hair color, eye color, and skin color. When pairs of chromosomes separate during meiosis, alleles from each trait also separate into the different sex cells. So you'll get an allele from your mom for hair color, and then you'll get allele from your dad for hair color, and so on for all of your different characteristics. When pairs of chromosomes separate, just like I said, these alleles from each trait also separate into the different cells. So the study of how traits are inherited through the interactions of alleles is the science of genetics. So certain scientists spend their whole career studying genetics. Gregor Mendel is known as the father of genetics. In other words, he is the scientist in history that discovered how certain traits are passed down from generation to generation. He studied mathematics and science, and he was also an Austrian monk. But he used plants to trace traits through the generations. He was the first scientist to trace one trait through several generations. He specifically used pea plants, and the traits that he used were the color, yellow and green, how tall they were, how short they were, what color the pods were, and there's a few other characteristics that we'll talk about that he used. We'll talk about them tomorrow that he used. So each time that Mendel studied a trait, he crossed two plants with different expressions of that trait. And he found that the new plants all looked, obviously, like one of the two parents. It wasn't just like a blend between the two colors. It was either yellow or green. So for example, in his first experiment, he crossed yellow pea plants with green pea plants. And the first generation of this cross, or all of the offspring, they were all green. Then he crossed this first generation, all the green ones, and he found that one out of every 4 plants was yellow, with the rest of them being green. So he concluded that this green trait was dominant because it was constantly covering up the yellow trait in the plants. So he called the yellow trait recessive because this trait seemed to disappear or not show up as much through the generations. Another example of a dominant trait in Mendel's experiment was the tall trait, which can be represented as a capital T here for tall. So most of the plants grew tall, while only some of them were short. So he said that the short trait was considered recessive, and any recessive trait is represented by a lowercase letter. It's really important that you know that when Mendel crossed the two purebred plants, they created the hybrid plants, which means that they received different genetic information or different alleles from each parent. For example, when the yellow and green plants were crossed, the yellow plant gave an allele for the yellow trait, while the green plant gave an allele for a green trait, giving the plant a genotype of capital T and lowercase t. So now that we're talking about Punnett squares, this all should start to make a little bit more sense. So first thing, it's important that you understand what a genotype is. It's simply the genetic makeup of an organism. So these are represented by letters. So an example is capital T, lowercase t, and any of these 2 letters right here. So your genetic makeup is just your alleles. So one of these is from your dad, one of these is from your mom. So you have 2 alleles for all of your characteristics. Now, and also the dominant trait is represented by a capital letter, and then the recessive traits represented by lowercase letters. And the phenotype is the way an organism looks and behaves as a result of its genotype, which pretty much just means that It's the actual physical appearance of the genotype. So if you had blonde hair, that would be an example of a phenotype. Another example of a phenotype is when the plant was yellow or green, or whether it was tall or short. Those are all phenotypes. So if an organism has two different alleles, a recessive allele and a dominant allele, it's actually considered a heterozygous for that trait because it has two different alleles, dominant and recessive. Now, if an organism has two alleles that are the same, both are dominant or both are recessive, it's homozygous for that trait, kind of as shown in these letters here. So this picture in the right is an example of a Punnett square. And let's say both of these flowers are heterozygous for the color red. So the capital R will be representative of the dominant trait, which will be red, and the lowercase r is representative of the recessive trait, which we'll say is yellow. So both of these, the mom and the dad, their color is red because they have a dominant trait in their genotype. So their phenotype will automatically show what the dominant trait is. So these four boxes are just kind of the predictions of what could happen. There's four options for the offspring, pretty much. And when you're doing Punnett squares, you pretty much drag the letter or the allele to each box. Okay, so the mom will obviously contribute one to every one, and the dad will contribute one to every one. So first we'll start with the dominant trait of the mom, and we'll bring it down to this box and this box. And we'll do the same thing with the recessive trait. We'll bring it down to this box and this box. And then we'll move on to the dad, and we'll bring his dominant trait over to this box and this box, and his recessive trait to this box and this box. So these are the four options for the offspring. So the first possibility is for the offspring to have two dominant alleles for red. So this will definitely be a red flower. It has 2 out of the 4 chances to be heterozygous for the color red. So these will show red, but they'll still have a recessive allele in their genotype. And then 1 out of 4 chance that the flower. So again, there's just 1 out of 4 chance that this flower will have the recessive color, which is yellow. So we'll talk a lot more about Punnett squares tomorrow, so don't worry if you have a lot of questions. Please write them down at the bottom of your notes. I apologize for the dog barking. Dakota was with me when I made this, so sorry about that. But have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you tomorrow.